I want to welcome everyone to the first ever episode of Beyond Innovation. My name is Justin Sirotin. I'll be your host. I'm here with our very first guest that I'm super excited about, Milan Kocic. He comes to us from a company called Hexagon. He has a very interesting background, having spent time across a whole array of different roles and different responsibilities. And we're going to be tackling this very real challenge of moving mature businesses in mature industries into a position where they're more engaged with innovation and less concerned about being conservative with their approach. And I can't wait to kick this off and look forward to taking all of you on this journey as we explore new ways to innovate within complex technical environments across a whole range of sectors. So Milan, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we just get right into your background as a start and give you a chance to kind of tell us how you got into this, what sorts of roles you've had, and where you're headed.
As we talked earlier, I am an engineer with Economist. I'm an MBA. I've done everything from technical roles, from sales roles, and more recently I've spent time in innovation and design, weirdly, even though I'm not a designer. But I would say that part of my career was doing design thinking before design thinking was called design thinking, which is, I was very curious.
You branded that.
Yeah, that's it. Because I was curious about different things, and I think because of my varied background, it led me down different paths of talking to customers about why do they do this, why do they do that, which is kind of what led me eventually to get into innovation and what I'm doing today.
So it's one of the reasons why I think we've been able to develop a good relationship over the years is because your background, my background, they're actually polar opposites. I come out of the design background, you come out of the technical backgrounds. But the common ground that you and I have been able to find is sort of, it's now branded design thinking, but really it's creative problem solving. It's something that we've been after for decades. So let's just talk a little bit about the way that we've had success in that and the way that you in particular have had success in that arena through this idea of using incremental gains within the environment that you work in, because it's different than trying to take these big step changes that most people go after.
Well, I'd say first you have to be curious. I think it's a requirement of any step of any sort is you have to be interested in why people are doing certain things. And as you kind of alluded to, we connected on the fact we're interested in like basic, simple stuff, not necessarily trying to boil the ocean as most people do. I think part of the problem in some of the mature organizations is they get drunk on big ideas because it's much sexier to go and talk about how you're going to solve every world's problem
For sure.
than to say I'm going to solve the 1/15th of the world's problem by doing this.
Right.
But I think it's very important to understand that no company can do big stuff all at once. So the key of the next big thing is a lot of little things is a kind of where everybody needs to go. Because I think if you solve a lot of little problems, the big problems will kind of be solved on their own. I mean, even today when we talk about whether it's COVID or climate change, you can't solve climate change by doing a project. No. It doesn't work.
Right.
And I think that's the gist of any innovation in a large organization is to kind of realize that you better tone it down than to try to always go for something big.
Yeah, and I think that the places where we've had success is when we've been able to show a path, but that path has a stair-step process that goes with it. So we're not trying to say, okay, let's get all the way to the end at the beginning. Let's get there sort of one step at a time. So you have a really particular customer that you service or have serviced through your career. So let's just talk about the challenges that you've seen in the industry that you're in because of the conservative nature of the customer that you have to focus on.
In a typical manufacturing or so-called advanced manufacturing environments these days, the biggest issue that you always run into is legacy, whether that's people, whether that's equipment, whether that's systems or anything else. In typical high-tech environment, it's relatively easy to make a change because things just become obsolete overnight and you can just switch everything.
Right.
It's very cheap to change a phone.
Right.
It's not very cheap to take a factory and change the whole factory to something. And we have gone as far as run into factories and find stuff that was built in 1930s and it still, punches a hole in the metal because that's all it has to do. So going to a factory and saying, I'm going to modernize you, I'm going to make you all connected to cloud, and we're going to do some blockchain and everything else is great in theory, and in practice you get lost. The other part, is also the issue of how much can you disrupt what they're doing day to day, because they still need to make widgets A, B, and C and put it out the door. So they're not okay, just you walk in and suddenly, well, hold on, let me tweak it because I just thought of something else. So they're much rigid environments, but it's important to realize that people in there are not really rigid either. They want better things. They want more modern solutions. They want their professional life to replicate their personal life. It's just that there's much more consideration has to be given as to how you're going to do that and how you're going to implement it, and it has to be in iterative steps. Otherwise, you're always going to walk in, promise, and never deliver anything.
Right, and that fundamentally comes from the fact that, as you said, they're living in this legacy environment that's been around for, in some cases, generations, and they're trying to figure out, okay, if I'm going to move the needle forward, I can't break everything that I've built in order to incrementally push myself into a new direction. So as you start to think about how to navigate that customer, what sorts of strategies do you use to start to unlock ideas that then can be promoted within the customer set first? Let's just start.
I think in our segment, in other advanced manufacturing, I think this might be the norm in other areas and fields, whether it's in high tech or social media and everything else, which is, continuous user research, continuous user feedback, believe it or not, is a relatively new concept in my field. Because in the past, because of some of the systems, they tend to last for decades.
Right.
The change usually required is incremental. So nobody expects to really, people are just like, well, I don't need to learn anything from customers. I know everything. Or you focus on a sales guy told me so, or you focus on that, well, we have one customer that asked for one thing, so we're going to go run around like chickens and actually deliver that one thing. So in general, when you look at a broader scope, the stuff that's been widely accepted in other industries as a way to do stuff, which is customer-led innovation, is something that's relatively new in the field that we kind of live in. And the work that you and I have done over the last 10 years is kind of expose the commoditized nature of some of the stuff that was at the time where I first started was very highly professional and very highly sophisticated equipment. Today is a domain of everybody. So the differentiation has to come from human-machine interfaces. How does this all work together? How is it put together? Because investment in making the equipment faster, better, more accurate, which is where we tend to do most of our work, is much more expensive than making the equipment more friendly, easier to use, easier to learn.
Sure.
So the typical kind of path of validation and user research and something is something that we started doing around 10 years ago to a much larger extent than we ever did before. So.
Right. And the success that's come from that, if you could just sort of talk through, like how have you seen change inside of your organization as a result of starting to get in front of customers in a way where you're almost instead of just leveraging them for revenue, you're leveraging them for knowledge. So if you could just get into how that's impacted you guys.
I think like every large organization, I wouldn't say that everybody's like a big champion of customer-led kind of research and customer-led innovation, but I would say a large segment of our technical staff has started looking into stuff that they typically just assume.
Right.
So your organization and us have done, half dozen research studies where we would go into the field and having you as a kind of an unbiased observer, see what's going on. And once you bring people evidence and you show them the photos and you show them the video and you say, well, this is what customers said, you remove that bias from the conversation. Because usually it's just a bunch of people in a room and it's a bunch of opinions. If you remove opinions and you feed it with facts, it's kind of a reflection of our society today.
Right.
You got to bring the facts from the field. People start understanding that nobody's trying to tell you that you're wrong, but they're trying to expose another opportunity how to look at a particular problem. And I think if you push it within the orgs as a non-threatening way to affect technical staff, especially our organization who is very, very engineering and very heavily technical, you have to kind of bring, I would say, humor and discovery and surprises. And you should we sometimes have done when our presentations like surprise stuff with the guy on his knees using a machine, weirdly taped flashlights and all the other things. And people kind of look at it slightly differently, like, this is what customers do? I never expected it.
Right.
And I think those unexpected things tend to bring more fans. But let's not, sugarcoat it. Not everybody's ever, going to be always on the board. But as long as the right people are there, there's a momentum to do the right things.
Yeah, and I think that idea of building momentum is a really important feature in sort of changing the overall culture and the overall ideas of how these teams start to coalesce around new ideas, because it's really easy to just sort of fall back on the things that you know. It's really hard to take that step to say, okay, well, if I want to push into a new space, how do I have the confidence that I'm not going to get bitten in the butt because I've gone down a path that nobody really wants? And so if you could just start to walk through how you've built momentum, both on the customer side, but equally importantly, internally within your particular organization, so that you're free to start to try a few things and experiment and occasionally fail and show where there's some success. Just kind of take us through how that process, how that journey has gone for you, because I've been a part of it. It's been a long road.
Well,
yours is even longer than
well, no, money's
even
very longer, but I think anybody who's in my similar role and despairs is you have to be patient. You have to have perseverance and patience. If you have to truly believe that what you're doing is the right thing. I think you and I touched in the past sometimes is that I think one cornerstone of what we did is building empathy into what people do. And I think the biggest thing you have to get over is I think people who don't relate to the empathetic way of looking at a problem have a much hard time relating to what goes on. And I think we've done it several times, and I've kind of told you anecdotes that we would like say, well, how does the tech support work? And people go, I don't know. So we're like, well, here's a phone. Why don't we just call tech support and see what happens? And we would discover all kinds of weird stuff that happens if you call tech support. And then you say, like, well, how is this okay for a customer?
Right.
And they will go, well, I guess it's not. And so, what that's called empathy.
Right.
And I think if you somehow bring people to the level of, okay, well, if you're doing this, why don't you put yourself in your shoes of what a customer has to go through to do exactly the same thing, and then think about it, is it okay? Because sometimes if you're just in a room and you're isolated from what happens, then you can just assume that, well, it's okay, it's not a big deal.
Right.
What may be not a big deal to me here might be a very big deal to somebody who sits on the factory floor and has to spend extra 5 minutes doing something, stupid, that we just assume it's okay. And I think the large point of people who accept it are people who are willing to then put themselves in the shoes of a customer and try to go on the journey that a customer has to go through. I think people who dismiss it are ultimately going to be the people who are not going to champion that cause. And I would say that in an organization as complex as ours, the key is finding allies who have power.
Definitely.
The key is finding people who align with you for the opinion. And the other key is to try to have some successes with some projects that you can then demonstrate and say, well, look, we did this and this is what resulted. They don't have to be financial, by the way, because even you and I know half of the stuff that we did is not necessarily a success financially. Yeah. But they're good in moving the needle to the next place so that you can kind of improve what you're doing next and try to get more allies in the organization to help you do that.
Yeah, those little incremental steps tend to help open up people's eyes to the potential big step that's in the future, instead of just always looking at a problem with all of the risks that are involved. You kind of go, okay, well, we can get a little bit of success, and we can build on that little piece of success, and then build on that next piece of success. So as you're building empathy and you're sitting in front of customers and you're trying to steer people towards this idea of allowing your customer base to participate in the next new idea, who from the team do you lean on to go be a part of that process? So how do you sort of bring people along for this ride?
Well, if we take a few projects we've done together, initially we had to come to you because there were no people on the inside who would A, know how to do things, B, be interested. I think
The interest is the real thing.
Well, the interest is because
They could figure it out. They just
correct.
didn't want to.
Well, no, or they didn't understand exactly what it
understand,
meant.
yeah.
Because a lot of times when you tell somebody you're going to get on a plane, go in the middle of Ohio, and sit in the factory and talk to Bob, who runs the CMM, they don't get way too excited about doing that. By the way, CMM is a coordinate measure machines, which is what Hexagon makes. And I think what we did well is we formulated questions to be slightly broader when we would do the research stuff. And then we started including people from product management to go along for the journeys with you guys into the field. So while you led as an unbiased observer what was happening, you had the staff from Hexagon who would sit with you and see things. And I think once they started discovering, for example, that the customers are actually willing to talk to us, which is the wrong assumption. People always go, they're too busy, they can't do stuff.
They all want to talk to
And I think the metric we've used is that we assign 2 hours and they always spend 4 or 5 hours telling us. Because by default, most of our customers, people are not interested outside of their inner circle as to what they actually do, probably including their families.
It's true.
So when we go and we spend good 2, 3, 4 hours asking them why they do what they do, what can be better, how it can be simpler, it becomes a different frame of conversation because the product management then sees the conversation through a totally different lens because there's no motivation to it. We're not trying to sell them anything. We're not trying to do anything else. It's a purely conversation of interest. And we're not asking them to tell us what they see the future. What we're asking them is so you walk in the morning, what do you do?
Right.
How does this work? And suddenly you discover things that you never thought were big things. And, our first project was this big project where we studied typical usage scenarios on coordinate measurement machines that are kind of big frames that move and measure things. And then we came back and everybody thought it was going to be something fancy and something super sophisticated. And it turned out that all the customers wanted just some light on the machines.
Right.
And there's also this problem you have in technical organizations like ours, where unless you have 6 PhDs deciding on what the next thing is, it's dismissed as not advanced or not good enough or not sophisticated enough. And I think it's this separation, an idea of what is innovation at the end of the day and what is invention. And I think
that's interesting.
Yeah. So to me is a lot of companies of our stature and maturity tend to think that invention is what cures all else and don't necessarily look for product market fits. They don't think necessarily tweaking a certain process by a little bit is what could make a difference because there's not as much effort and under parentheses under quotation marks that gets you there.
Yeah.
So I think once you start opening eyes to people, they start looking at innovation through a different lens. I don't think they necessarily then start going, wow, how many PhDs were involved in this project? Right. They start looking, well, what exactly did you learn? What was the source of it? And I think that's what started making allies within our organization to then go, well, how can they also do the same thing?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that statement that you make is accurate, which is that the more technical the space, the more the team feels the next new thing needs to be technical. When sometimes it's sort of right in front of your face, just make it easier to use. Just give somebody some lighting so that they can see what they're doing.
Yeah.
Put the screen in the right place so that they're not turning their head and all day long trying to do some whatever it is. And I think that's an interesting observation that the team itself sort of has a desire for the next thing to be complicated because that's what makes everybody that's exciting to be working on those kinds of projects.
I think it's more a judgment of us than a judgment of the problem. And I think people who are highly technical feel better fulfilled if the problem they're trying to solve requires a complex technical solution. Yeah. Because I think they otherwise sit there and go, well, all you needed was to change A to B and that solved the problem? Wait. But I don't need 14 years of education to tell you that. Yeah. And I think that's more of a psychological question to solve than anything else.
And interestingly enough, what we've found in the multitude of companies that we work with that end up in this really complex solutions is that once you expose people to the fact that it doesn't always have to be complicated, that they almost get more excited and more into. I mean, I'm thinking specifically about one of the engineers that we worked with at your company that came with us on one of our journeys. out to a customer and came back so excited and enthusiastic because they got to see things that they'd never seen before, because they were standing in front of a customer and the customer said, no, just like pick that thing up and put it over there. And they were like, oh, that's easy. Instead of always like picking up the big rock and carrying it up the very large hill.
Well, we've also, you and I have seen this in the field too. We've seen solutions out of duct tape and wire ties.
Crazy stuff.
That people do because we don't give them the utility that they are requiring to have, which is then if you're in the field, how you otherwise going to know that? How are you going to know that people essentially hack your equipment so that they can do A, B, and C? It did happen with our first project, which is building a jog box for the CMMs. And we discovered all this kind of things that customers just do on their own. As a matter of fact, I think we found wiki entries of people hacking things to make it easier to go like the beeping on a jog box. And I think, how are you going to do that if you just sit in your room? You won't be able to know that stuff. So that, the key ingredient is talking. Now, let's not be overly kind of, rosy about this stuff. It's not that the customer is also going to give you all the solutions.
Never.
I think it's, you and I have kind of talked about this in the past, which is this idea that we have to have some sort of an idea.
Yeah.
And then kind of see, does that idea tend to work? We've also been pretty good at recruiting some of the customers to kind of help us on the journey. Now, we have some challenges there because we tend to sometimes recruit overly enthusiastic customers. So they sometimes maybe not present a realistic picture, but it's good to at least validate some of those ideas with those particular people because it gives you a different standing as to where you're going to go next.
Yeah, and I think as you said, you got to be careful not to get tunnel vision, because if you have too few customers giving you feedback, then you end up in this place where you're sort of saying, okay, well, that's the answer, that's the truth, when in fact, there's a whole audience over here that you haven't.
That one guy told me so.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's true. I mean, we've all been sort of swayed by that really powerful voice in a research project, and you always have to sort of check yourself, okay, well, does that fit the demographic that we're after, and what other voices can we add to this conversation to make sure we're not overly focused on a single solution. So as you've been in this category for a very long time, 25 plus years in the manufacturing sector, working in a space that has, if you look back from where you are now to what it looked like when you started, is a totally different landscape. It just happened over a sort of gradual progression over time. So give us your sort of view of how you see your particular situation evolving with the role that you're in, and now the new role that you're taking, and where you plan to sort of take this in order to keep this momentum that you started over the course of a decade moving in a positive direction.
First, you made me sound really old by saying such a long
you
time.
Are,
but
and so am I.
But I think when I first started, what we did was very specialized in the domain of the few. I always joke around, it was a domain of the lab coats. And what's happened is the thing that we have observed together, which is this commercialization of B2B space, which is that in the old days, all innovation happened in a B2B space and somehow made it into the commercial world.
Right.
Xerox Spark and all the stuff with Apple and the mouse and all that stuff. In the more recent time, it seems that it works in the other direction, which is a much more dynamic space for innovation, is really commercial space. And then pieces of that are coming back into the B2B and making people what they accept and commercialize in their personal lives expect no different behavior in a space that we are in. Because of that, the spectrum of innovation is much broader. Like when I first started, you just worked in metrology, which by the way is not weather, it's a science of measurement. And you worked in metrology, you were a specialist, that's the only thing you did and then you had a certainly sophisticated computer and you did what you did. Today it's the domain of everybody. It's a commodity, it happens, and you just have to know how to do it. When it's a commodity, there's a whole different aspect of what you have to innovate in. We as a mature organization suffer from the same place that every mature organization lives in, which is you have business units and then you have distribution part of the company.
Yep.
And business units cannot disruptively innovate because their job is to deliver quarter results and the numbers. And you can't disrupt that flow by coming in and saying, well, let's try something new. It's too much risk, too much, and it's dangerous, and it could disrupt everything that goes on. And then if the CEO shows up and next quarter is all off, then lots of heads are going to roll because of that. So we're kind of embarking on this idea that a lot of mature companies do, which is you try to go a little bit of outside. You try to embed the culture of innovation. You try to affect how people think. You're trying to take this thing that we talked about already, which is affecting a small group of people, and try to see how we can scale it to affect a much bigger group of people.
Right.
So we kind of decided that, well, maybe it's time to give it a try to do something slightly different, which is to build up an open innovation platform rather than an accelerator. Accelerator to me are rather narrow, and there's like 8 million of them out there. We try to kind of pick a different route, but still find a space where we can engage with startups and new ideas in a safe space. Rather than there's no pressure from like, well, what's the next quarter going to happen? What are you going to deliver? It's a space where we can talk to startups. We can find things that fulfill our technological gaps or our customer requested gaps, and then choose whether we want to invest, not invest, pursue, do something with it, or anything else. And then the outcomes of it could be many different things, joint ventures, acquisitions, and everything else. But the idea is also to be very transparent about the process, what we do, how we do it. Because if you transmit it back into the organization, suddenly the organization is going to see what these little startups can do. The fact that you can find 5 people doing something extraordinary that we would think is impossible. Because I think in a lot of mature organizations, there's a sort of negativity mindset. And what I mean by that is that you sit in a room and you spend 90% of your conversation talking about how something is impossible to do versus how something is possible to do.
Right.
And I think that because you have an immediate defensive mechanism that something that's too risky, we should just not touch.
It's like this funny delusion of the inexperienced that allows them to go, oh, I could probably pull that off. Whereas when you're not inexperienced, you kind of go, I tried that once and it didn't go that great.
I mean, you have kids, I have kids. You look at a toddler,
they're
going to bang their head, trip over, fall down because they don't have the experience of travel. They also don't have a concept of yesterday and tomorrow, so they're just living it today.
Right.
So they'll just try whatever they need to try. And I think a little bit that innocence is what needs to drive innovation. And I think startups, in a way, have that innocence. Like they don't have the memory because they've never been successful and they've never failed yet.
Right.
So they're kind of like in this limbo going like, okay, well, maybe it's going to work out, maybe it's not. They hope for the best.
Yeah.
We all know that vast majority of them will not succeed. But we believe that one thing, for example, that the open innovation platform, which is called 6 Sense, I don't know if I mentioned, is this idea of having a sense where they need to go. And we're more interested in kind of scaling startups. We're interested in companies that kind of have a little bit of a product market fit, but they're struggling how to grow the business because vast majority of startups tend to fail in a scaling portion of the business.
Right.
Most people can build a product. Most people can find one customer. Many organizations fail at finding 1,000 customers. And
so you're trying to find people who are already on a path.
Yeah.
You're not trying to find them at the beginning of their path, but
we'll never exclude it. But we're more interested because I'll just be honest. We talk about innovation in a mature company.
Yeah.
We're kind of okay at innovation.
Yeah.
We're really good at making money.
Really good.
And I think you can parlay that into an organization where you can help startups now be more successful financially.
I see.
Which then parlays that ability to pull their innovation into the organization. So kind of there's a cumulative effort of we become better innovators, they become better business
That's
people.
Great. Yeah.
And then we combine into something that kind of fits together.
Well, I mean, it's a genuine sort of synchronizing of the two needs, right? Like scale-ups or startups, they sort of lack the distribution, they lack the infrastructure, they lack the organization. They have a bunch of good ideas, but they lack the rest of it that can turn it into something. And you guys can come in and say, okay, well, we've got this incredible infrastructure, this incredible organization behind us.
I have a good example for you. You just brought us a startup recently, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I talked to them, and even though their solution is kind of this, it's in a niche space for what they do. Yeah. During the conversation, we discovered we could probably apply it to 5 other areas within Hexagon.
I didn't even know that.
So the whole idea here is, I think part of scalability is potentially could you take the same technology behind what they're doing and could you apply it into the different areas, which allow them to scale naturally without trying too hard.
Right.
Now, not everything is going to fit that particular scenario, but that's one of the ways to look at this kind of stuff. And I think, I don't know, I'm not a believer that everything has like a box solution.
No.
And I think everything's kind of always a little ambiguous and you kind of have to figure it out. I think the other part of mature organizations is they have less appetite to iterate. A lot of stuff, including process in our organizations, are very defined. You start here, you go do this, you launch the product, and you finish, then
Sure.
you move on to the next product.
Right.
I think what's happening is that more and more products are very software intensive. More and more products are not right the first time around because you need some sort of validation in the customer hands. Mm-hmm. And you need to have organizations be more comfortable with ambiguity around products. We all know the infamous histories, the first iPhone, the first this, the first that. There were interesting things, but they sucked in general.
Right.
But you give somebody 5 years of enough of a success, they'll build something that you really want. And there's very rare, I don't know if you know, but I don't know of any version 1 product that was like, runaway success of doing something in general.
I love the story of GoPro, or if you've ever seen the first GoPro, you mounted it to your wrist. It was gigantic, and it was just made for surfers. And apparently it was terrible. And now look at what they've built from a hardware standpoint. Look at what they've built. So there's plenty of those examples out there.
True, and I think if you look, you just mentioned GoPro. GoPro pivoted from being hardware only to being software mostly, and being a platform kind of company. And I think, but that's a journey. You start over here, you build something, then something else. And I think for us is the same thing. We were very specialized capital equipment company. And now we're trying to grow up to be more services and software and other things. My last role before taking on the open innovation was the ability to innovate in services and support.
Right.
And people are going to laugh, maybe who come from different sectors, but we introduced the first service subscription platform. Whoa!
It's a manufacturing sector. that's a new
Nobody
thing.
does that in manufacturing sector.
But it comes back to the thing you said earlier, which is the fact that the influence and the inspiration in these more mature categories is coming from a totally different place than it used to. It used to be coming from within the technology itself, and now it's coming from outside of that technology and saying, well, wait a minute, I've got a subscription for everything in my life. Why am I paying you by the hour to come service my capital equipment in my factory? Why am I not buying that as a subscription?
To expose as the brilliant thought I guess behind this was the fact that people who have a piece of equipment, then have a piece of software, then they would have some associated accessories and something like this, and they would get calls from all these different people,
right,
who would ask them, well, can I come and service A, B, C, D, E, F?
Right.
And the customer say, can I just get one call?
Right.
Can I get one person to come in and take care of all of this, and I'll give you one payment, and then just remind me next year, and I'll pay you again. So that's what we did, and the customers love it because it's no different. And I said an anecdote to somebody. So imagine taking a car, and then a tire guy comes out and says, well, I got to change the tires. That will be $200. And then a wiper guy comes out, and I'll change the wipers. It's $50. Right. And then at the end, and you're like, oh, can I have the bill? Oh no, we have to pay each person separately. And I'm talking back to our original subject of empathy. If you don't think that's acceptable in your personal life, why would you want to put the customer through the same thing? Right. And I think that's that kind of cycle of that. In innovation, sometimes it's simple as bundling a bunch of stuff.
It's like, because of the legacy nature of some of the companies that live in mature spaces. So you live in the manufacturing sector. There are other mature sectors that we do some work in the utilities sector, same problem. You do some other work in the healthcare sector, same problem. Where it's like these sectors have been around long enough where they have weight to the way that they do things, and they have momentum behind old habits, and just moving those habits becomes more challenging, I think, than everybody realizes. And some of the things you're touching on is just like, well, if it's okay for you in your personal life, when you go home and you do it this way, why can't I just do that at work? And that's a clever way to look at this.
I thought about this recently, and I think a good thing that's analogous to us, in some ways, it's Peloton. Because you look at Peloton, the bike is a bike. Like any of the manufacturers that make exercise equipment makes probably better bikes.
It's a commodity.
But they're selling a service.
That's right.
And they're selling a lifestyle. And this is what they include, which is why people love to go out and get one.
Right.
And I think you look at our equipment, since our equipment is a commodity, now you have to do service and lifestyle. Right. Now, lifestyle in a different way. It's still lifestyle.
It's meaningful.
And you have to enable people to do things they were not able to do before. Like we've together built a product called Pulse, which is a simple IoT device, tells you about environment around the machines, which is very important. And we had a customer anecdotally mention to us they have 150 machines, and they said, "Wow, it's weird. Now that I know what's happening with my machines, because the killer app on our Pulse device was the fact that it would message you when something went wrong.
Right.
And because it would tell you something went wrong, they would know what kind of things went wrong, and they could reset the machine remotely and everything else." And the guy said, "Oh, you know what we do? We walk 4 to 5 miles less per day."
4 to 5
Miles less, because
What?
these plants are obviously different. And when you translate that, what's 4 to 5 miles? That's usually about an hour, takes you an hour to walk 5 miles. That's an hour per day
Fast walk.
that customers get back.
Yeah.
Hour and a half they get back.
Yeah.
Translate that to a full year. 400 hours of time is now given back to the organization to go do something.
It's worth a lot.
But if you actually, we go back to original thing, if you talk to an engineer, they would try to quantify something totally much more complex than that.
Right.
In this case, it's very simple benefit.
Right.
You tell me what happens, I walk less, I have more time to do other things.
Right.
And that
Costs me less money. I
Yeah.
can use those resources for other things. I can be more productive.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera. So
Exactly.
That's interesting. Okay, so as we sort of wrap this up, I want to come back to the non-accelerator, which you're calling an open innovation platform, and just give you a chance to kind of explain where that's headed and how that then dovetails into the cultural impact of the organization that you work in and the intent of that relationship between bringing in companies from the outside and then starting to drive forward from almost from within, while giving the external resources the opportunities that they need to grow.
Thank you for asking that. I mean, we like usually, same as what the practice we learned with you guys, is we interviewed a bunch of startups,
Yeah.
we interviewed a bunch of VCs, and we asked them kind of what's the bigger thing. So one of the VCs told me, startups don't need funding, they need customers.
Uh-huh.
That's a key thing to tell everybody, which when we asked the startups, which is what it proven to be. So as we kind of discussed, that's the key kind of component of what we're trying to do.
You actually did customer research in the startup world as you got this thing off the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we knew some startups that we know from before, and we just kind of said, okay, so this is what we're trying to do. Do you think there's any value?
Yeah.
And they said, awesome. The fact that you're going to provide us access to Hexagon customers' tools, and then you're going to help us build a business, that's what we need. I don't need money. And that's more of an American than a European. There's a little bit difference between the two, but that's kind of where it sits in. But in a bigger scope of things, one of the pillars of why we decided to do this is the kind of cultural influence on the organization itself.
Right.
Which is if you publicize what we do, if we expose people to do things, hopefully, there's no KPI for this.
No.
You're going to organically try to see some people be excited. I can tell you already, people who have heard about this, they want to be part of this.
It's
because
exciting.
it's something new, it's something exciting, it's something to do differently. If I look more broadly, where does this go? I think an organic way how this could grow is that it starts with an open innovation. Then we invite internal innovation by adding an incubator to it. Mm-hmm. So we start encouraging people with ideas, because one of the problems you have with typical organizations that are mature is that you have an idea, but you have no funding to do anything with it.
Right.
So what we do is we incubate, we give them some money, they build a proof
internal
of concept.
money.
Internal money,
ideas.
exactly.
Yeah,
internal ideas.
It's a good idea.
And we incubate those internal ideas that could potentially become projects.
Mm-hmm.
There's a secondary. Sometimes we're going to run into startups where we just hire them. We hire the people out of a startup. Now you start embedding the culture with outside people, or we acquire them and they become part of the organization. And then the third part, where I see this, like 3-4 years, most of the open innovation platforms last anywhere from 2 to 4 years, and then they transform themselves into something. Whether it becomes a venture capital arm for corporate investment, whether this becomes an innovation lab, where we build this kind of safe space where people can just sandbox and experiment things, because technically that's what's missing today, because everything that we do has to be accounted for and capitalized, which is anybody who learns in R&D, they're going to learn about capitalization very quickly.
Yeah.
And ability to raise money internally. People joked around. I had an interview a couple of days ago, and we talked about, well, how are you going to talk to entrepreneurs when you're never an entrepreneur? I said, well, if you look at my career, I'm an entrepreneur, I guess, at Hexagon, because I've done those kinds of things. And the idea is that we need to transform that by bringing people in, by allowing them to kind of embed themselves into the organization. And I think, 5-year plan is to have Hexagon who is slightly transformed into a different place.
That's great. Okay. This has been fantastic, and hopefully all the listeners out there have been able to get some insights into how you at least have navigated this sort of challenging landscape that inevitably comes from maturity, right? This doesn't go away. Companies, as they get more mature, tend to start a retreat into themselves, because especially if the business model is just sort of rolling, and the danger there is that somebody comes up from behind you and you never even saw them coming because you're just plugging away at your business the way that you do it, and then all of a sudden that startup that you now are entering into your world and trying to grab them early takes market share, and that's when people really start to pay attention. So this has been great for me.
Thank
I
you.
hope you've enjoyed it. Why don't you close with your LinkedIn so people know how to get in touch with you, and anyone who's interested in reaching out regarding the accelerator, regarding you specifically, regarding the processes that you've talked through.
You can find me on, just look Google or look for Milan Kocic. That's Milan, last name Kocic, Kocic on LinkedIn, and you'll find the only one weirdo. There's a couple other Milan Kocics, but you won't confuse me for them. We don't necessarily have the URL we have is a little too complex to kind of spell out. So around late January,
That's the
just Google Hexagon Sixth Sense,
Yep.
and you'll find our landing page. And if you're a startup listening to this, and you're in a smart manufacturing, advanced manufacturing space, deep tech, we encourage you to go to the website, and there'll be an application on it. You can apply for our program, and there's spelled out exactly what it is. So we hope we see some of you on the flip side.
Yeah, I think this program that you're building is going to be really valuable to those who join it from the outside, and hopefully valuable then to the organization as a whole. So that's great.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.